Hi everyone, it's Agnieszka from 5 Minute Language. Welcome to my channel. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't already and give this video a like. So this is another video in my series of Is X language difficult to learn? And I've made quite a few of those, so make sure you check them out as well. But essentially the idea is to show you the reasons why a language can be quite difficult to learn and the reasons why it can be quite easy or relatively easy to learn. So overall, there's lots of different factors that will affect whether or not you find a language difficult, such as all the other languages that you already speak, or your native language, or your kind of individual learning style. But essentially, some of those things that I will be talking about will apply to many learners, regardless of their native language or other languages they've tried learning before. So today's video is about Russian, and it was actually requested many times in the comments on my other videos. So it sounds like a lot of you guys are learning Russian or thinking about learning Russian, and you would like a little bit of advice on how difficult the language really is. So I have attempted learning Russian. I don't speak it, but I have learned it in the past, so I have got some experience of learning it. So I'm going to start with the things that make it relatively difficult. And the first one, you guessed it right, it's quite obvious, it's the alphabet. So when you see a language that has a completely different alphabet to the alphabet that you're using in English or in your native language, you might be a bit freaked out. You might think, oh, that's too difficult for me to learn because I don't even know how to read it. And it's that unfamiliarity that makes it slightly difficult. I will talk about what makes it relatively easy in the second part of this video, but let's now move on to the second thing that makes Russian relatively difficult to learn. And it's the sounds of the Russian language. So there are certain sounds that either don't exist in English, for example, at all. So you will have to kind of do a little bit of exercise with your mouth to be able to say those sounds, or the letters that are very similar to English are pronounced completely differently. Or there is a subtle difference of pronunciation sometimes, which actually makes a lot of difference for the kind of comprehension aspect. So if you mispronounce it slightly, it actually sounds really wrong, if you know what I mean. So the third thing, and maybe it's something that I should have mentioned as the first thing, because many people find that quite tricky, are the cases. So what I mean by a case is, you know, in English, for example, it's quite straightforward. When you say a sentence, you say, I have a dog, or this is my dog. The word dog doesn't change. It's always the same. Whereas in languages such as Russian, there are cases. So depending on the function of that word, dog, the form will change. So it will be a slightly different word, and you will have to kind of be able to identify what case you need and then what the form of that noun should be in that sentence depending on its function. So it sounds a bit complicated when you're not familiar with the idea of cases, but essentially, you know, there's several of them. You have to learn the different rules that govern them, and that can be quite overwhelming because it's not just a question of knowing the word dog, but it's a question of knowing how to use it and knowing what case you need for a particular sentence. So the next thing, which is quite typically difficult, or that Russian learners find typically difficult, something that I found difficult as well, are conjugations. So verbs are conjugated, and they're conjugated in a way that is slightly more complicated than in languages such as French or Spanish, for example, where you can learn the patterns, and then when you're learning new verbs, you can just apply the patterns that you've already learned. So in Russian, obviously, there are patterns, but the conjugations can be a little bit more irregular. Let me just explain briefly about conjugations. So when I say, I go to the cinema, she goes to the cinema, go and goes are different conjugations of the same verb. So in Russian, it's the same for every person, singular and plural. You have different conjugations, and you have to sort of, you know, sometimes you can learn the patterns, sometimes you can't. That can be quite tricky. Okay, the next one is a sentence structure or word order, which can be quite confusing in Russian. So Russian is a more flexible language than languages like English or French or Spanish. You know, in English, there is pretty much just one kind of typical word order where you have subject, verb, object, and you always follow that same pattern. Whereas in languages such as Russian or Polish, it's more flexible. You can kind of move the different parts of the sentence around without too much impact on the meaning. So that can make it a little bit more complicated for a Russian learner. So now I'm going to move on to the things that make Russian relatively easy to learn, or not as difficult as you might expect. So the first thing, going back to the alphabet, it can be a bit overwhelming when you look at it, but actually it's a phonetic alphabet, and you can learn how to pronounce each of the different characters that it is made up of. And it's not like, you know, Chinese or Japanese where you've got thousands of different characters. There's a very limited number of characters, very similar numbers to English. So you just learn all the different letters, you learn how to pronounce them, and then you'll be able to write and read very quickly. I remember learning it probably in a couple of days. It's not really as complicated as it looks. Russian tenses are quite straightforward. When you think about somebody learning English as a foreign language, you know, some of you watching this video will be speakers of other languages who have learned English as a foreign language, so you will know what I mean. When you learn English, you've got to learn like 16 different tenses or something like that. So it's very complex, whereas Russian is much more straightforward. There's a clear idea of, you know, when to use a future tense, a present tense, or a past tense. So that can make it relatively easier to learn than other languages. Then the cases. So I haven't got a lot to defend cases or to prove that they are easy to learn. They're not easy to learn. But what makes them relatively easy is if you have learned another Slavic language, such as Polish before, for example, you will find it easier to learn Russian because the cases are more straightforward, there's fewer of them, and there's fewer exceptions than in Polish. So this is just for those of you who have attempted Polish and are now learning Russian. So the next one, I've already mentioned about the sentence structure and the word order. It can be confusing because of its flexibility and how you can move different things around, but it can actually be an advantage and something that makes the language relatively easy to learn. And it's the flexibility. So the fact that, you know, you can get it wrong and people will still understand what you mean. Because in languages like Spanish or German or English, you have to stick to quite strict rules. So if you swap the word order in a sentence, it might actually become very confusing and completely incomprehensible. Whereas in languages such as Russian, it doesn't really matter as much because people will still understand the gist of what you're saying, even if you get the word order slightly wrong. And like I said, there's lots of different configurations in which you can put the words, so it doesn't really matter as much. The next one is a lot of Russian vocabulary is derived from Latin. So there are a lot of cognates. So for example, if you enter Russian English cognates into Google, you will be able to see those lists of words that pretty much look the same in both languages. They are just pronounced slightly differently. But yeah, there's plenty of those words, so you can kind of have a head start there if you already speak English. So the next one is there are a lot of resources for learning Russian, and that can be a real obstacle for people learning more obscure languages. You know, they're finding it hard to find resources, but with Russian there's plenty of stuff available for free online. There are YouTube channels, there's stuff on Netflix you can watch in Russian, lots of different vloggers, podcasters, and so on. And obviously, you know, lots of books available in bookshops as well, which is a great plus. And the final one is about native speaker availability. So obviously there are a lot of Russian speakers in Russia, but also in other countries. And you will find native speakers not just in those countries where Russian is spoken as the first or second language, but also all around the world. So if you live in the United States, for example, you will find a lot of people who use Russian as their first language or second language there as well. So you can kind of easily organize a language exchange or find a teacher or meet people who speak the language, which is a great plus. And that makes it relatively easier to learn than a language where native speaker availability is limited. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure you give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel, and leave me a comment as well telling me about your experience with learning Russian. And I'll see you next time. Bye!